much for joining us this evening for the last of 2017 night course for the end of the world. During the Cold War, there was real fear of nuclear destruction by accident or design. And as 2017 comes to a close, I think we'll all agree that we still feel those fears. Are we heading for a political nuclear meltdown? And if so, can we or would we want to survive? I'm delighted to be joined by Ben Tonra, Professor of International Relations at UCD. Ben has served as a chair of the Royal Irish Academy Standing Committee of International Affairs, along with a number of other accolades. We're going to be live streaming the event this evening, so feel free to tweet or mention on Facebook if you have any questions at the end. And I'd like to give Ben a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Orla, and thanks to the Science Gallery for the invitation. And I can't think of anything more warm and festive than to sit down and talk about nuclear Armageddon in the first week of Advent. So this is where we're at and this is where we are. What I'd like to do over the next wee while is talk about a couple of things. Talk about nuclear weapons per se. What are they? How do they work? What do they do? Talk about a little bit where we are in terms of the aforementioned Doomsday Clock. The wonderful exhibition outside has the Doomsday Clock there and gives you a sense of the timeline of the clock in terms of our proximity to nuclear and other global destruction. And then maybe in the event of nuclear conflict, what are the options? Where do you go? What's a practical guide to survival in a nuclear age? And pretty much the answer to that is none. And then towards the end, I'm going to focus particularly from a political science IR perspective on how we got here and what are the strategies that we might look at to obviate the possibility of nuclear conflict. And that obviously is my forte and specialization. I can't speak specifically to the physics of nuclear fission detonations and throw weights and all the rest of it. So if there are physicists in the audience, you might bail us out there in the Q&A afterwards. But this is what we'll do for the moment. So this is where we start in terms of nuclear Armageddon. We start with Fat Boy, and we start with Fat Boy and Little One. These are the two bombs. One dropped on Nagasaki, one dropped on Hiroshima. Killing 70,000 in one instance and over 40,000 in another instance, with hundreds of thousands of injuries thereafter. And it's useful to bear in mind that in terms of their specific capacity, what you're looking at is today having over 200,000 times the capacity of one of those bombs in terms of our current global nuclear capability. And the effects of that, the effects of that in theoretical terms, sort of in conceptual terms, I think we have some understanding of. This is I wouldn't describe it as a postcard, but it's a record from one of the pilots of the Enola Gay of Hiroshima in the aftermath of the dropping of the bomb on that city. And as you can see, there were particular local circumstances in terms of the topography and geography of the area. Also in terms of the nature of the site, in terms of the prevalence of paper and wood in terms of construction, which lent that particular bomb its particular devastating characteristics. But nuclear weapons themselves, as we'll see in a moment, have certain characteristics which we need to be conscious of and aware of when we think about their use, their potential use, and how we get rid of the damn things. Again, just in terms of the scale of what we're looking at the height of the Cold War, we had a global stockpile of 61,000 nuclear weapons. Now, the counting of nuclear weapons is a little bit problematic, as we'll see in a minute, but just get a sense of the relative scale here. Our current capacity, our current stockpile is about 15,000 weapons, approximately 7,000 each, 15,000 weapons in total, 7,000 each for the US and the Russian Federation, France at 300, China at 260, UK at 215, and then in italics, because they're not part of the nuclear club, which we'll talk about in a minute, you have some of the declared and undeclared nuclear weapons powers in the world. So you can see from that we still have, notwithstanding the end of the Cold War, notwithstanding the peace dividend that resulted therefrom, notwithstanding very substantial cuts in the capacity, the nuclear capacity of the two preeminent nuclear powers, the former Soviet Union, now Russian Federation, and the United States, there's still a lot of nuclear weapons out there. And one of the questions that we can ask ourselves maybe in the Q&A afterwards is why those nuclear weapons still exist. What is their role? What is their purpose? What is their function? And why has it been, and why does it continue to be so difficult to get rid of the things? These are sort of the basic delivery systems. These are how the bombs are dropped. The two missiles at the top, or the two bombs at the top, are about 1.2, 1.3 megatons each. And they strap very handily beneath sort of your common or garden jet bomber. The submarine below, again, both on the US and on the Russian Federation side, you have comparable delivery systems. That particular vessel, I think, has about 190 missiles on it, nuclear-capable missiles on it, and there are dozens and dozens of those submarines prowling the oceans even as we speak. In terms of the counting of nuclear weapons, this is one of the reasons why it's slightly problematic, and that is their glorious mobility and their multiplicity. In the top left-hand corner there, you see what is a multiple re-entry MIRV top to a missile. What this means is that one missile can contain multiple nuclear weapons, and each of those nuclear weapons, each of those nuclear bombs, is independently guided. So you have one ICBM goes up, you can have 3, 4, 5, 6 independent nuclear weapons disseminating from that missile to predetermined targets. And of course, you have the glory of these things wandering up and down the roadside across the Russian Federation and elsewhere in terms of very large intercontinental ballistic missiles that are in fact mobile and not restricted to silos. And those, if you don't mind me saying, those are meant to be the good guys. Those are the people who have all of the control systems. Those are the people who have the command and control structures to manage very large nuclear arsenals. But of course, the nuclear threat isn't limited to those two large nuclear powers or indeed regular nuclear powers, because you also have the prospect of non-state actors getting their hands on nuclear weapons. And this is sort of a live area of concern, because you don't need the gloriously high-tech intercontinental ballistic missiles to make a real nuclear mess on the ground. With a little bit of physics and a little bit of luck and a little bit of theft, you can come up with your very own little dirty bomb, which can do serious and substantial damage, particularly in a highly populated urban area. You don't need very highly enriched uranium or processed plutonium. You can get away with the kind of stuff you get out of a common or garden nuclear reactor. It's not technically difficult, as I say, to come up with this kind of technology or to apply this kind of technology. And we know for a fact that upwards of 40 kilos of highly enriched materials have been stolen over the last number of years. Most of that has been recaptured, but not all of it. And we also do know that only 2/3 of the 600 tons of Soviet fissile material is known what happened to. So we've lost 1/3 of that. And we don't know whether we've lost it in terms of just bookkeeping exercise mistakes, or whether it's just laying somewhere and nobody knows where it's there, or it's gone into other hands. We just don't know. And that is obviously, in the context of informal nuclear capacity or informal non-state actors, is obviously a cause of concern. But the one that obviously we're talking about most of at the moment are so-called rogue states. Now, I'm very careful in the language here. You know, one person's rogue state is one person's homeland. So let's not get too hung up on who's rogue and who's not rogue. You could describe either the two superpowers as rogue in terms of their reliance on nuclear technology and nuclear weapons. But what we're more often talking about are states like the Democratic Republic of Korea and to a lesser extent Iran, as states outside or compromised by the global non-proliferation regime, and apparently willing or allegedly willing to engage in activities which are contrary to established norms of nuclear posture and nuclear deterrence. And a big role in that, particularly for the International Atomic Energy Agency, is monitoring nuclear programs in all NPT states and states that subscribe to basic international norms. Because again, that dividing line between a civilian nuclear capacity and a weapons nuclear capacity is not desperately firm. There's quite a bit of movement across and between that particular line. So one of the issues for international governance, as we'll talk about a little bit later, is how you maintain the rules of civilian nuclear programs not bleeding over into nuclear weapons programs. And then we get to the Doomsday Clock, and this is a nice little graphic which just gives you a sense of where we have been in the past since the Doomsday Clock was invented by a group of physicists, some of whom were actually part of the Manhattan Project and the US nuclear program, and in terms of their assessment of how close we are to serious nuclear engagement. And as you see, we've had some green periods, and we are now at one of the most red periods. In other words, one of the most dangerous periods in terms of nuclear proliferation and the potential use or deployment of nuclear weapons. And again, reasons for that we'll talk about in a little while and can review in the Q&A. Interesting little graphic here which sees basically the time lapse of nuclear proliferation and development of nuclear weapons from these scientists. You can see as little red dots go off, those are nuclear explosions, those are declarations of capability. You see the green coming on as states acquire nuclear capacity. In the corner there, you see the number of warheads and missiles as they develop over time, and you get a sense of the historical development of these things. One of the things you'd like to note, for example, is there's only one country has developed a nuclear weapons program and given up on it, and that was the Republic of South Africa. In the 1980s. They had a nuclear program, they had 3 or 4 viable nuclear weapons, and with the change of government, change of regime, post-apartheid or just before apartheid's end, they gave up on that nuclear program. But nobody else has given up. What you also notice in that timeline, that diagram, is the proliferation patterns. One side, one actor gets one, the opponent feels the need to get one, they develop, their opponents see the need to get one, they develop, and it's almost a domino effect. From the United States to the then Soviet Union, People's Republic of China, India, Pakistan, you see the proliferation wave as you go through this. And that is a very, very real issue, which we'll come back to in the end in terms of what is the logic underpinning nuclear weapons and what kinds of logic can be applied to the elimination of nuclear weapons going forward. But the proliferation issue is absolutely key, and you see how that has developed, as I say, over time. Then you get into sort of what a lot of game theorists like to do, and that is as a simulation game. You know, where does the crisis come from? What is the dyad of nuclear powers that might lead to a nuclear exchange? And really, you can let your imaginations run riot at this point in terms of thinking about the kinds of nuclear conflict possibilities that arise from different kinds of regional crises. This is my fun list. This is the one that I came up with just off the top of my head, sitting in the office one afternoon last week, thinking of all the different permutations and possibilities. You can pick your own, or add to, or subtract from if you so choose. The one I'll just mention in a little bit of detail is the one that obviously we're talking about a lot at the moment, and that is the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Now, what's interesting about the DPRK is the protection of or the proliferation motivation is not so much that they feel a threat from a nuclear-armed regional power. They don't feel a nuclear threat from China, which has traditionally been one of their sponsors. There's no direct threat from Japan. But their indirect threat is from the United States, or their perceived indirect threat is from the United States. So to obviate the possibility of what they would see as a US attack on the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, they feel the need to have nuclear weapons that they can then apply in their own strategic doctrine. And as we'll see when we talk about nuclear strategy, there are some interesting questions there to arise as to why the DPRK feels the need to have nuclear weapons and what the international community can now do about it. Because as a breakout nuclear power outside the framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there are some very interesting questions or very interesting challenges that arise therefrom. And the other thing that you have to think about, of course, is not just the formal potential for conflict between any of these particular dyads of nuclear powers, but also the possibility of just a simple, flat-out error. Simple, flat-out mistake. Somebody dropping something or arming something they didn't mean to drop or arm. And again, this comes back a little bit to the good nuclear powers versus the bad nuclear powers. Again, in the cases of both the United States and the Russian Federation, you have long-term experience, intricate command and control mechanisms. You have an infrastructure there to manage this enormous potential for destruction. If you get down to some of the smaller nuclear players, particularly Pakistan, India, Israel, DPRK, etc., you at least begin to ask yourself the question, well, how good are their systems? in terms of command and control? How effective are they? What is the scope for error? What is the scope for simple mistakes being made in terms either of the loading of a missile or the arming of a missile or the potential use therein? And all of that is gloriously theoretical, and it's all about numbers, and it's all about countries, and it's all very antiseptic, and it's all on a lovely piece of paper, in this case, on a lovely, pretty colored slide. But we do have to remember what we're dealing with. And what we're dealing with is partially on the next slide. So if you're easily upset by things, you might want to look away for a moment and just hear me talk. But as I say, I think it's important to deal with the realities with which we're dealing. And that's a young boy found in Hiroshima, just under a kilometer away from the epicenter of that particular nuclear strike. One of, as I said earlier, tens of thousands of residents of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki on which nuclear weapons were used. So this is what we're thinking about, this is what we're talking about, and this is what we're trying to obviate the need for or the possibility of. In terms of the mechanics of that death, just so you know what you're facing, again, in the glorious festive season that we're in, just think about blast, think about fire, think about radiation. This is why nuclear weapons are so, in military terms, gloriously effective. Because they are hugely destructive with relatively small effort. And in military terms, in kinetic military terms, that's all to the good, because these are very powerful weapons. In terms of the blast, you're talking about an X-ray heated air shock, upwards of 2, 3, 4 kilometers in diameter, depending on the megatonnage. You're talking about a radiant fireball of several thousand degrees centigrade, radiating out from the epicenter of an airburst over a center of population. And you're talking about the consequent and associated radiation. And you die from any one or any combination of those three effects of blast, fire, and radiation. And if you're thinking in terms of what we have at our disposal, a 1 megaton nuclear device exploded in the atmosphere over a center of population gives you a 2-kilometer blast wave, a 3-kilometer lethal radiation dose, and third-degree burns up to 10 kilometers away, as well as blinding you up to 80 kilometers away. And that 1 megaton air detonation, we have, as we said earlier, a capacity of about 6,500 times that. So take that effect, multiply it by 6,500 times, and again, that gives you a sense of the effect of what global nuclear conflict can accomplish. And again, blast, fire, radiation. I think blast we're familiar with. We know what a blast is. We know what a fire is. But let's get a little bit deeper in terms of the radiation. What does a good lethal dose of radiation look like or feel like? Well, it's dysfunction in your central nervous system. It's gastrointestinal damage, uncontrolled internal bleeding. There's a bit of crack. Bleeding from gums or within the skin, which sounds especially ghastly. Massive infections, and obviously death. So again, this is a weapon that's a very particular kind of weapon, a very different kind of weapon. It's analogous really to chemical and biological weapons, which we have banned at a global level. We have global treaties which ban the use of chemical weapons, which ban the use of biological weapons, which are near universally applied and universally subscribed to. We're aware of controversies in Syria where the regime there has deployed very, very rudimentary chemical weapons. But there are very powerful international norms against those two categories of weapons of mass destruction. And we don't yet have the equivalent on the nuclear side, although we'll come back to that towards the end. Now, as I say, that is pretty ghastly. Again, the 2 kilometers of the blast range, the 3-4 kilometers of the fire range, the deadly nuclear radiation. But what about survival? What about recovery? What about humanitarian aid and assistance? Well, again, you need to think that through, because in terms of giving aid in the event of some kind of a nuclear exchange, your possibilities are limited and compromised. You're talking about an area, a substantial area of a highly populated, densely populated area most likely, where you now have no local electricity, water or communication systems. You have no medical or first aid infrastructure at all. You have impassable roads, impossible even to get in other than via air. You have, of course, associated with that then the collapse of medical infrastructures around the area of nuclear destruction as people flee to and look for aid and assistance. And it's not as though you can easily send people in with those materials to do anything about what has happened in that particular area, because you are sending people into a death zone. And in order to go into that death zone, they will have to be equipped in such a way as to limit their mobility and limit their possibilities of interaction with civilian and local populations. And again, the important thing to bear in mind here is this isn't theoretical, this isn't historical, this is today. I was just, again, you know, as a result of Orla's invitation, trawling across the website looking for interesting information to share with you, and I came across this really cheerful little cartoon, which was published in the last 6 months in the northwestern province of China, bordering on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is telling kids how to deal with nuclear weapons and nuclear destruction. Telling kids to be sure and wear their little masks, which of course will provide them with little or no protection whatsoever. Telling them to be sure and wash their boots when they come in from nuclear irradiation outside. Telling them to be careful about shaking their clothes because of the nuclear radiation and dust which would have impregnated their clothes as a result of fallout. And, you know, giving them a sense of, you know, the death and destruction because of the little child vomiting up in the corner there. So again, not theoretical, not historical, real and today. And one of the things that strategists have to think about, and one of the things that policymakers have to think about in particular is, well, what would even a limited nuclear exchange look like? If we set aside the prospect of the terrorist group letting off a dirty bomb in Dublin, London, New York, Paris, Berlin, wherever. If you set aside the possibility of the one rogue state and the one missile. If you talked about a limited global or a limited regional nuclear exchange, what are you looking at? And we've had some scientists have looked into this and have tried to model this and have given us a sense of what a localized, in inverted commas, nuclear exchange might deliver or might look like. So if you think, and we won't mention any particular countries, aka India, Pakistan, no, we won't go there. But if we're thinking about a local exchange of up to 100 megatons, exchange, about 100 weapons, you're talking about 5 megatons of black carbon going into the atmosphere. About 2 or 3 degrees of global cooling, which we'll talk about in a moment. 9% reduction in yearly rainfall, 20 to 30% cut in the ozone layer. Crop season shortened by up to 30 days. 1 billion famine deaths, and another 1.2 to 1.5 billion in starvation as a result of the climatic, agricultural, and other local environmental changes in that particular geographic region. So it's not just dealing with, as I said earlier, the blast, the fire, and the radiation, but the long-term environmental consequences of that kind of even limited nuclear exchange are quite horrific. Apart then entirely from the additional disease, epidemic, and general misery that would result therefrom. So that's a little nuclear exchange. What about a bigger nuclear exchange? What if something were to go drastically wrong between the US and the Russian Federation, between China and the Russian Federation, between the US and China, etc.? And I don't think it's too melodramatic to say the end of effective civilization in the countries concerned. You're talking about, you know, mass radioactive dissemination and resulting in associated deaths, permanent and wide-scale economic environmental damage, and this glorious prospect, seeing as how this is the festive season, I do want to make a link to Christmas, the prospect of something called a nuclear winter. It's not snowbells and snowballs and Santa Claus and Christmas trees. This is something that is really fundamental and quite scary. And I'll go to the diagram. That's not a great diagram. I'll go back to the thing. What is effectively happening is because of the bursts, the dust, the particulate pollution that comes up from this kind of nuclear exchange, you're changing the atmosphere. you are putting up into the atmosphere material which effectively either reflects sunlight or absorbs sunlight. In my own little mind, I mean, I'm thinking of this in terms of the extinction of the dinosaurs. And, you know, the great huge comet that came down, the dust went up, and we had the winter which allegedly took out all the dinosaurs. This is our modern day human equivalent, because this is what a nuclear winter looks like. And so apart from the blast, the fire, and the radiation, you basically come to a point at which photosynthesis cannot occur on the planet, or occurs at such a reduced level that billions upon billions of us will starve to death as a result thereof. Hence, I think the aphorism, you know, that if there's a nuclear holocaust, you know, the best strategy is just to bend down and kiss your ass goodbye, because there's not much point in going on thereafter. But nonetheless, we have to think through not just implications, but also means of obviating this. And in terms of the planet as a whole, in terms of a global nuclear exchange, there really, as I say, the strategies for survival and getting through it are limited and unattractive. This graphic, I don't know, does anyone recognize that little pamphlet? Just hands up, just to get a sense. Yeah, I've found one in my grandmother's attic. This was delivered by the Civil Defense. I'm thinking back in the sort of 1950s, early 1960s possibly. Late 60s, thank you. Which was essentially the Irish government's guide to surviving nuclear holocaust. And I couldn't get all the pages. It is actually on the internet if you want to have a look at it. But it is glorious in how banal it is, and glorious in as much as it gives you no sense whatsoever of what you're really facing as a result of nuclear. Essentially, one of the main things in that little pamphlet is they advise you to basically get under the stairs in the event of nuclear. And when you come out from under the stairs, that you shouldn't drink the water. Which leaves a number of questions unanswered in terms of nuclear survival thereafter, but it is important to bear in mind the banality of what that survival advice actually provides. And I just love the lyrics from Tom Lehrer. I think they're prosaic but interesting. We will all go together when we go, every Hottentot and every Eskimo. When the air becomes Uranus, we will all go simultaneous, or we all go together when we go. That, as I say, gives you a sense of the utter futility, perhaps, of trying to think about survival after nuclear conflict. But what I want to really talk about, apart from depressing all of you in the festive season, what I really want to talk about is how we avoid this. You know, what are the strategies available to us to ensure that this global nuclear Armageddon, this global nuclear exchange, or even little nuclear exchanges don't occur? And there are broadly 4 strategies. And again, I'm coming at this from a political science IR perspective, so I'd love to hear other suggestions and other formulations from other disciplines and other areas of your own lives that might be relevant or germane. But four strategies sort of in the international relations literature. One is stay true to what we've got, which is essentially a system of what's called mutually assured destruction, the glorious acronym of MAD. A strategy of widespread nuclear proliferation. Note that. That'll be a fun one to have a talk about. One about nuclear non-proliferation, the current nuclear non-proliferation regime, and the very most recent moves to actually ban nuclear weapons in their entirety in the global system. But first, let's start with the ones that are perhaps more fun. The first is mutually assured destruction. And there is a beautiful and clear logic to this strategy in sheer international relations political science terms. And for those of you who come from any kind of a social science background, and particularly if you're friendly with economists, you will be aware of rational actor models, you'll be aware of gaming and simulations to try and map out, describe, explain, and predict human behavior. And out of gaming and out of rational actor models of decision making, we come to something which is called the Nash equilibrium. And that is what mutually assured destruction means. You have an equilibrium. You have a perfect balance of nuclear threat and counter threat, which makes the prosecution of war simply impossible. Because if both parties on either side of a nuclear divide know that a nuclear war will destroy them as well as destroy the object of their enmity, then there is no point, no rationale in having a nuclear exchange. So if you're going to be destroyed and they're going to be destroyed, and you know that in attempting to destroy them, they're going to destroy you, nobody gets destroyed. You have a perfect balance. It is mutually assured destruction. And this was the paradigm across the Cold War. This was what worked. This was what was called the nuclear peace. Credibility is absolutely critical here. In other words, the credibility of the threat from the other side has got to be maintained to the extent that you cannot allow the possibility of the other side surviving. And the other side must know that even in the event of the massive preemptive strike, the other side will still be destroyed. That's why you have the proliferation of numbers. That's why you had tens of thousands of nuclear weapons over the period of the Cold War. Because even if you took out tens of thousands of the other side's nuclear weapons, there are still tens of thousands of nuclear weapons targeted at you from multiple platforms. So you had ICBMs in silos, you had airborne, you had sea with submarines, you had tactical nuclear weapons, you had such a number of platforms, such a plethora of nuclear weapons that each side knew that it couldn't preempt their destruction and they couldn't cause the destruction of the other side such that they would not be destroyed. Leading even to, and I was going to put a clip up, but it's technically complicated to put movie clips up, that famous scene in Dr. Strangelove, when the missile comes out of the bomber and the guy with the cowboy hat is riding the bomb all the way down to his target in the then Soviet Union. And we know, because we've seen the film, that the Russians have their Doomsday device. Now, at the time, that's sort of a comic device, and it was interesting, but both sides did have their Doomsday device. Both sides had systems which assumed that a massive preemptive strike from the other side had taken out the entire military political leadership, destroyed entire command, communication, and control systems of their militaries. So that they had computer systems in place that would launch nuclear weapons without human intervention. Those were the respective Doomsday devices. And they had to exist. They were part of the logic of mutually assured destruction to ensure that both sides knew that the other side could not win, could not preemptively destroy their capacity. The other thing to bear in mind with respect to mutually assured destruction is you had to delimit, you had to make illegal technologies which limited each side's ability to attack. Now, this gets into very contemporary conversations, particularly with the Russian Federation, on anti-ballistic missile technologies. In other words, these are technologies that the US has installed and is installing in Europe, which are, from a US perspective and from a NATO and allied country perspective, designed to destroy incoming nuclear missiles from rogue states, aka Iran or Iraq or whomsoever might attempt same. From the Russian perspective, however, that's a problem. Because if you install a technology that delimits Russia's capability to destroy the West or destroy Europe and North America, you are destabilizing this doctrine of mutually assured destruction. What the Americans and their allies have said in response, of course, is that these systems can only be used and would only be targeted at and are only targeted at geographic regions of space that does not interfere with Russia's nuclear capacity. A fact that has given no assurance whatsoever to the Russians or President Putin, which is why this is still an issue of ongoing controversy. But they did actually agree international treaties preventing each other from attacking each other's incoming ICBMs, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And that was designed, as I say, to ensure that both sides knew that each side could destroy each other. But the problem, as with all economists, in my view, and a lot of social science, in my view, is that can you assume rational action? Do we assume that the famous little man in North Korea and Pyongyang is a rational actor. God help us, can we assume that the President of the United States is but that's another conversation, is a rational actor. So the problem is, what if a nuclear power has nothing to lose? What if you're facing the obliteration of your regime, the destabilization of your regime, the loss of power, you've got half a dozen nuclear missiles probed, ready to go and targeted, and just in your last act of retribution, desperation, and just piss-offedness, you push the red button. Because that is not accommodated for in the Nash equilibrium and mutually assured destruction. And that is something of a problem. But I hear the economists and rational actors among us say, no, we have a solution for that. The solution for that, get this, boys and girls, the solution for that is everybody should have nuclear weapons. So this is your visual depiction of what mutually assured destruction is, and the logic and the clarity and the simplicity of that doctrine. But when we get into nuclear proliferation, we get into a whole new world of wonderful. Because here what the argument is that if we all have nuclear weapons, if we're all threatened by global nuclear destruction all of the time, nobody will ever use nuclear weapons. In parentheses, I'm part of a research consortium which is looking at conceptions of global justice and European foreign policy. And part of that is going out in the world and listening to people, particularly from what are called BRIC countries or developing countries or rising global regions, to get their take on what is justice, what is global justice, what is their perception of Europe as an international actor, yada, yada, yada. We had a fascinating series of meetings in Delhi about 2-3 weeks ago. And we went to one of their preeminent institutes of strategic studies. And a guy there who was trained in Berkeley, postdocs in Harvard, sort of late 50s, early 60s, I mean, a real éminence grise in terms of Indian nuclear strategy. And because security is my bailiwick, I said, okay, talk to me about India's nuclear capacity, talk to me about the logic, talk to me about your position in terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And his answer to the strategic threat that India faces from China is that India should give nuclear weapons to Vietnam. His logic being that the Vietnamese are the only people who have defeated the People's Republic of China in conflict. The Vietnamese are incentivized to keep the Chinese at bay, and they face a conventional threat from China. And that if India proliferates nuclear weapons to Vietnam, that will restabilize the regional balance in South Asia. We've had a very famous IR specialist write a very, very big article in one of the major journals of international relations called Foreign Affairs. It's an American journal. And his argument was that not only should we not prevent Iran getting nuclear weapons, Iran should have nuclear weapons. Because again, the logic being you need a regional actor in the Middle East to balance Israel's possession of nuclear weapons. Now again, take that logic to its logical, if so absurd conclusion. Everybody should have nuclear weapons, because if everybody has nuclear weapons, nobody is going to use nuclear weapons. This is the proliferation thesis. What's interesting, though, is that there's been sort of a bit of a fight back against the proliferation thesis. And interesting, the fight back led by some serious Cold War warriors, including people like the late Zbigniew Brzezinski, Henry Kissinger, people from that era in terms of the Cold War. Their argument is both fascinating and patronizing all at the one same time, because their argument essentially is that so long as mutually assured destruction and this argument about proliferation was limited to mature powers, aka the Russian Federation and the United States and, your Common Guard in the UK and France, so long as they were in charge, all was well. Basically, we can trust them. They have the maturity, they have the experience, they have the technology. But their argument in the current era is that proliferation is increasing the number of wildcards in this scenario. So that with the North Korean capacity, with Israel, with India, Pakistan, China, with a prospect of nuclear-capable Iran and nuclear weapons therein, the stabilization that mutually assured destruction gave us is less stable. So these people have actually come together with what they call the global zero counter-movement, which is saying we need to talk about nuclear disarmament in a much more serious way than we have to date. Because this is what nuclear proliferation would look like. We all stand there, we all have a gun at our neighbor's back, and we know that our other neighbor has a gun to our back. In a sense, and I don't want to make a very political point here, in a sense, this is not dissimilar to the US domestic conversation about arms and guns and gun control. That if everybody has guns, everybody is so much safer. And we know how that works out at a domestic level in the United States. So our third strategy, so we've had mutually assured destruction, sort of between the mature players. We have the proposal for nuclear proliferation to obviate the prospect or possibility of nuclear conflict and nuclear war. What we're particularly working with in the contemporary era, though, is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty regime. Now, this is an international regime of treaty and laws and norms and expectations and institutions whose function and purpose is to govern nuclear weapons and nuclear capacity. Fascinating point for a local audience is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was opened for signature in 1968, originated in an Irish proposal to the United Nations. The then Irish Foreign Minister, Frank Aiken, talked about or delivered a speech about putting all nuclear weapons in the control of the United Nations, taking them out of the hands of individual states, and creating a global system of governance for the use of nuclear weapons. Now, that idea didn't actually go anywhere, but from that idea, which became known later on as the Irish Resolution, the UN began negotiations which ultimately led to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, and in recognition for Ireland's role in that, Frank Aiken was invited to be the first foreign minister to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968. And we'll come back to the Irish record on that in a moment. But what the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty does, what this control regime establishes, is essentially a system of haves and have-nots. So those who had nuclear weapons in 1968, you're grand. You're part of the nuclear club, and you have certain serious obligations in terms of the dissemination of both civilian and military applications of nuclear materials. And your whole purpose, the whole function in Strand 1 of the NPT is to mitigate, to prevent, to forestall the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So those who have, keep, but don't spread. The second element of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty regime is, of course, nuclear weapons disarmament, because everybody promises in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that they want to get rid of nuclear weapons. So you have non-proliferation, but you also have, in the second pillar, disarmament. In the third pillar, you have the dissemination and use of nuclear technology for the generation of civilian electrical power. So this entire regime accepts from the start that everybody is entitled to nuclear energy and nuclear power. The purpose and function of the regime, however, is to ensure that those civilian applications don't morph into or bleed over into nuclear weapons capacity. So you have two subsidiary institutions here, well, three institutions, but two subsidiary institutions. The Nuclear Suppliers Group, the NSG, which is the group of the haves to make sure that nobody is getting their hands on technology they shouldn't to proliferate. And you have the International Atomic Energy Agency, whose role is to promote, facilitate, and enable all UN member states who subscribe to the treaty to develop civilian nuclear power, but to ensure through direct inspection on the ground that everybody's playing by the rules and nobody is trying to develop nuclear weapons on the sly. Which, of course, is precisely where we get to Iran, which was a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty regime, which was found to be in breach of its obligations in terms of civilian nuclear development, and which then resulted in UN sanctions against Iran to ensure or to derive a situation where the Iranians destroyed the illegal capacity that they had developed and did not attempt to replicate. In the case of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, again, you had a member state of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, subscribed to all the requisites therein, had a civilian nuclear program, and then declared itself to have a nuclear weapons capacity, to throw out the International Atomic Energy Agency, and again resulted in UN sanctions. Now, the North Koreans insist that because they've withdrawn from the treaty, they should be left alone. But nobody else is recognizing the legality of their withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So those are the problems that already exist within the NPT regime. The other problem, of course, is you have states that have not subscribed to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty regime. And there's no obligation on them to do so. I mean, if the UN has a treaty, it's open for signature, but it's not compulsory that everybody has to sign. And a number of states have refused to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Specifically, Israel, Pakistan, and India are not signatories and have merrily developed their own nuclear programs, both civilian and military, with the resultant nuclear capability that we've spoken about. Now, there's a whole conversation and a whole literature here on, well, how exactly did the Indians get their hands on nuclear weapons technology? And who might you think could possibly have been interested or supported Israel in its development of nuclear weapons technology? And what blind eyes were thrown, what sotto voce agreements were arrived at, what kind of high-level secret, etc. Now here, I mean, there's a whole realm of secrecy and subterfuge and espionage and all sorts of things that get into it. There was espionage, there was the stealing of secrets, there were postdoctoral students who got working on sensitive projects that suddenly went back to their home countries and were rapidly promoted and became fathers or mothers of respective nuclear programs. But there is also a geostrategic element here, in terms of China having nuclear weapons, and then India getting nuclear weapons, and then Pakistan developing nuclear weapons, etc., etc., etc. The big thing that has to be borne in mind here is that the NPT regime has been ongoing since 1968, and we have regular review conferences. And the frustration throughout all of these review conferences has been centered on this fact of the haves and the have-nots. Because you've drawn a very artificial line. 1968, full stop. Nobody can be a nuclear military power after 1968. So from an Indian, Pakistani, Israeli perspective, that is illegitimate. Why are they not allowed to have nuclear weapons, and yet France and the UK are allowed to have nuclear weapons? Where is the equality? Where is the equality? Where is the recognition of their sovereign rights as states to defend themselves in the face of what they perceive to be overwhelming conventional threats? So they look at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty regime like this. You know, one law for the haves and a very different kind of law for the have-nots, which is, for them, an unacceptable situation. This gives you a sense of the respective nuclear arsenals in blue of those within the NPT regime, and in red of those outside the NPT regime. And again, if you're coming from, let's call it a red dot country, your perspective is, well, where's the problem here, guys? Is it really with us, or is it really with the big blue blobs at the center of the diagram? Are they the ones who should be held to account for not vigorously pursuing a serious and substantial move towards global nuclear disarmament? And we haven't got there. We're no further on in terms of that disarmament than we were at the end of the Cold War. We've had substantial cuts in weapons, but as you've seen, we still have upwards of 6,000 to 7,000 weapons on both sides of that divide. Which leads us to our fourth and final methodology for obviating the prospect of nuclear war, which is that of an absolute and outright nuclear weapons ban. Now, as I've said, we have similar comparable regimes for both chemical weapons and biological weapons, but we don't have this regime applied to nuclear weapons, which are at least as, if not more, devastating and inhumane than either chemical or biological weapons. And there's an interesting archaeology here to consider. In 1996, the World Health Organization asked the International Court of Justice to rule as to whether or not nuclear war was in fact illegal. And after a lot of humming and hawing and a little bit of controversy, did the WHO have legal standing to bring the case in the first instance? And then the UN General Assembly came in and asked the International Court to take on the ruling. They ruled, in effect, now the lawyers amongst you may quibble with me on this, but in effect, the International Court of Justice said that nuclear war wasn't outright illegal, but if the humanitarian consequences contravened basic international humanitarian law, nuclear war would be illegal. So in other words, the International Criminal Court set up a process or set up a question, if you can prove that nuclear war is inhumane, then we can talk about nuclear weapons being illegal, which then initiated a process through which a number of UN member states, including and very notably this state, engaged in a very detailed process through multiple international conferences, multiple meetings with scientists, both physicists and environmentalists and geologists and sociologists and every kind of codology you can mention, brought them into the room and asked what would be the effect of nuclear war. The consensus arriving out of those conversations, and it doesn't come as any blinding surprise to anybody here, was that yes, nuclear war is inhumane, which led to a second phase of this process, in which, again through the United Nations, a treaty to ban nuclear weapons as being inhumane was promulgated, negotiated, and agreed at the United Nations. It was agreed at the United Nations this year, with 122 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 1 abstention, and 69 countries refusing to vote. That is to say, refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of the vote itself and the applicability of the vote itself. No prizes for anyone to guess who's in the 69. Because again, nuclear arms, nuclear weapons, and nuclear strategy is endemic to current strategic balances. And you see the quote there at the end, that the proposed treaty, and this is from, I think, the British delegate, the proposed treaty was incompatible with the policy of nuclear deterrence, which has been essential to keeping the peace in Europe and North Asia for over 70 years. Because again, what they're referring back to is mutually assured destruction. That is what keeps the peace. And for anybody to declare that nuclear weapons are illegal destabilizes that balance, destabilizes that strategy, and opens up greater potential for conflict and war. So those are your 4 strategies. Mutually assured destruction, as we have at the moment, mapped onto a nuclear non-proliferation treaty regime which isn't functioning in the way that it was designed to. Nuclear proliferation, as a glorious strategy of everybody with a gun to their head. Or potentially a global nuclear ban, which again runs and flies in the face of nuclear strategies over the last 70 or so years. So where do we go from here? I think one of the things that's important for any informed citizen is to engage in these debates, to think about these debates, to do what we're doing here and talk about these issues and exchange ideas and reflections on both the reality of nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy, the implications of nuclear conflict and nuclear war, and what is to be done about it. I put a little bit of a plug in for the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which has done phenomenal and Trojan work over the last number of decades, largely without anybody caring a curse for the work that they're doing, because it gains nobody any political brownie points. It's never anything that a politician is going to find on the doorstep when she's asking for her vote. No one's going to say, well, what about the NPT regime? So it's something that happens in the background with a lot of time, effort, and energy, but with very little political recognition, but something for which the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade should take some comfort and should certainly be congratulated on. But if you don't do that, if you don't have that capacity to engage yourself, to inform yourself, to engage in not necessarily protest, but informed conversation about these issues, at least have the courtesy. At least have the courtesy to remember that young boy from Hiroshima. At least have the courtesy to remember what nuclear weapons have done on this planet, and to extrapolate from that what nuclear weapons could do on this planet. And if you're not willing to do that, if you're not willing to engage, if not in activism, at least in remembrance, at least give him that much remembrance, then my only suggestion is the final. Dig yourself a dark, deep, dig yourself, alliteration, a dark, deep hole, because that is the only other strategy you have in terms of survival from nuclear holocaust. Thank you all very much.
Food for thought for this evening. I know December is not the greatest month to be talking about digging a deep, dark hole to bury yourself in. Thank you very much, Ben, for incredibly insightful and terrifying. I say that each of these talks is terrifying, but it seems like they're getting more and more terrifying. Before we open it up to questions, I'm going to try something. Don't worry, you're all safe-ish. For people who have questions, I was wondering if you could potentially talk to your partner and put your question to them first before putting up your hand. So maybe if you guys could come to kind of like a conclusion or a question together, and then I'm going to go around with the mic if that's okay, just to see what questions or comments come up as a result of that. I know I've made that sound way scarier than it is.
No, just have a conversation. Yeah. I mean, turn to the person next to you, whether you came with them or not, and say, you know, what is the most striking thing, if anything, from that presentation? What have I not talked about? What did I not talk enough about? What is it you want to know more about? Have that little micro conversation, and then we can generate some questions thereafter. Basically, just try and warm me up and have a conversation on the glories of nuclear Armageddon.
We're not listening. It's fine. Did we have a question from
There's one over here already.
Already? Yeah.
Hi. Sorry. Just to ask you, through your research, do you maybe know of any country or countries that started research on nuclear weapons but never finished it or never had a weapon?
As I say, South Africa gave up on theirs. Yeah. Sweden also had a very busy nuclear program until, I think, the early to mid-1960s. Maybe even a little bit later than that, but that's my recollection. So yes, is the short answer.
I was asking because I'm actually from Croatia, and we actually heard that Yugoslavia was also having, but I'm not sure if it's correct or not.
Again, you need to think about. I mean, there are pretty fine lines between civilian nuclear capacity and military capacity. So, to say that, you know, were they developing? You know, did anybody ever think about it? I think you've probably got a very long list. Did anybody ever set up the lab to try and develop the technology necessary? The list gets a bit shorter. Did anybody develop the lab and successfully begin to test? The list gets shorter still. So, I mean, you could probably plot a fascinating map of who thought about it and who ended up with it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. My question is twofold. First of all, is it technologically feasible to actually have a nuclear warhead explode in mid-air and not cause any damage?
Run that by me again?
Is it possible to have a nuclear warhead explode during its trip towards its target?
Oh, I see what you're saying, yeah. Well, then, I mean, obviously you're not getting blast, you're not getting fire, but you're still going to get the radiation.
Yeah. Radiation.
Yeah.
So it's not feasible to make nuclear warheads obsolete by researching a technology that makes them explode in midair before reaching the
No,
target.
because as you saw, you'd have massive irradiation in the troposphere, and you saw the impact on the ozone layer. So you'd be erasing a large chunk of the ozone layer, even if, if you had the 10,000 missiles coming in, they all explode midair through magic wand technology, then you've got a shed load of fissile material in the atmosphere.
And that
So
would be
that's a bad scenario
to
as well.
end all life on planet Earth.
There, I don't know. There you'd need to talk to a cosmologist and a physicist to see exactly what the impact of several megatons worth of enriched uranium and plutonium dribbling down through the atmosphere.
I see.
But it's not a good look, certainly.
Doesn't look good, indeed.
No.
Thank you.
That's all.
I think we have a question here.
Hi, thank you so much. I have kind of two questions. I suppose what you've taken us through tonight, there seems to be a lot of flaws in the thinking of, how we manage this, just a few. What do you think is the discipline, if not economists or politicians, that can be the architects of disarming us? And furthermore, what is the institutional structure that has the authority, the understanding of people, the understanding of all of the different ramifications to actually hopefully get us to a point of a disarmed nuclear world?
Two things, I think, is political will and institutions and governance. And institutions and governance is sort of a slash, not a third word. You've got to have the political will, because nothing is going to happen without political will. And as you can see from the voting record on the nuclear ban treaty, you've got 69 countries that profoundly do not have that political will and whose defenses are intrinsically based on a nuclear strategy. So getting their minds changed is a Herculean political task. Once those minds are changed, you can then develop the governance and institutional structures to insist that the norms, the rules that you've agreed unanimously are applied unanimously. But as you can see with the NPT regime, even when there is the will, there still is that process which can happen by the result of nefarious means, illegal means and other means which can disseminate this stuff out to other parties. So one of the big things, if you had a nuclear ban treaty, was, how can you be sure that nobody has held on to nuclear missiles, nuclear capacity? To what extent will national militaries open themselves up to inspection? To what extent will you have people flying into Moscow, flying into Seattle and going up country lanes to make sure that every single silo is empty, there's no submarine, etc. So you're talking about a big Herculean task in technical terms, but that's possible with the governance institutions, but it all has to start with the political will. And that's where you come in, because it's only you who can force the political will, that can force the national conversation, that can force the international conversations through which that political will is developed. Because, as I say again, if your national defense is predicated on a nuclear first strike capacity, as is NATO's, there's 20-odd countries in Europe whose defense relies on a nuclear first strike capacity. And those conversations have to start in each of those countries.
Can I ask one more question? I totally get what you're saying, and I agree with a lot of it. But I suppose if you take the people in this room this evening, we're like 2% of the people who come and listen to these lectures and take this seriously. And political will, as you've said, is established from public demand. So do you think there is enough will in, academics and journalists and people who are not necessarily in the public discourse every day to create the necessary demand to kickstart the political will?
Well, where that happens is through electoral politics. So, the next time someone knocks on your door and asks for your number one, don't talk about potholes, talk about nuclear weapons. You might get some awfully shocked faces from candidates on your doorstep, but it's also about civic engagement. It's also about NGOs. It's also about activism. It's also about having conversations with neighbors. Even in response to daily newspaper reports as to what's going on with DPRK. They keep launching these missiles which are nuclear capable. Where's the conversation surrounding that? Is that something out there and of no importance to us? Or is it of importance to us? And what did the foreign minister say about it the last time it happened?
Hi there. Hi. Thank you for the presentation. Just one question. What country voted that it's not inhumane?
I think it was the Dutch.
The Dutch?
There was one NATO member that decided to vote against, as opposed to the rest who all refused to vote.
That's why I was very curious. Who would vote no?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll tell you another thing. I mean, I don't think I'm revealing secrets. I met somebody from a foreign ministry of a country that has itself been the subject of a nuclear attack. And that foreign ministry official said, very frankly, they did not support the nuclear ban treaty. And the position, in fact, the public position of the Japanese government is not to support the nuclear ban treaty. Why? Because Japan's defense is predicated on the United States providing that defense, and the US defense is predicated on a nuclear capacity. So, and I don't mean this in any way to criticize the Japanese position, but it is a matter of fact. You can only imagine, you know, the psychological process that has to go on to think, well, on the one hand, we know what this means, and you know how active the Japanese governments have always been in terms of anti-nuclear. But their physical security, their existential existence, faced with the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, which is lobbing missiles on a regular basis into the Sea of Japan. You know, if Japan was to forswear US support, US defense, where would it be in response to that threat? So I don't at all want to give you the idea that, oh, this is a no-brainer. You know, we all want peace, security, open-toed sandals and brown rice, and hold hands and all will be fine. No, not at all. Because there are very, very serious issues of the existential existence of some countries being seen to be dependent on a nuclear defense. And Japan is, if you like, a tragic and ironic example of precisely that.
Jen, just one final thing, a follow-up on that. I was quite curious about the Hiroshima, Nagasaki thing, just out of pure interest before. And it looks to me that I'm not in favor of it at all, but it looked to me as there was nearly no other option to stop the war between the Japanese and what they were doing in Korea, North Korea, China. So don't you think that maybe that it's also maybe the MAD hypothesis would make more sense than banning nuclear weapons altogether?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a very vigorous historical conversation about, you know, was the bomb necessary? And were two bombs necessary? Because, you know, one was dropped, and the Japanese said, you know, we're still in this, you know, keep the faith, we're going to win. And so they did drop the second. Now, again, historians will argue and historians will disagree, but that is the calculation that political leaders made at the time. And one can criticize them in retrospect or congratulate them, well, not congratulate is the wrong word, but at least recognize the realities of what they were dealing with in terms of, to use the economist language again, a rational cost-benefit calculation as to how many fewer lives would be lost using one and then two of those awful weapons, as opposed to another 5 or 10 years of hand-to-hand combat in the streets of Tokyo.
We've got one question.
Thank you for your talk. We saw what happened a little while ago with the UK warhead that went off incorrectly. Are these systems still safe? A lot of these aging systems. And what happens with the MAD dimension if they're proven, some countries are proven to not have the capability they say that they have?
It's a risk we live with daily. And I mean, I don't say that to be melodramatic in any sense. One of the big issues we had with the collapse of the Soviet Union was, you know, who gets to keep the bombs and who gets to control the bombs. In the end, we were very lucky. The Ukrainians, the Belarusians, all of them that had nuclear weapons on their territories, handed them over to the Russian Federation. Now, I will say that you talk to Ukrainian politicians today, and they're very pissed off that decision was made. Again, you know, to come back to the point about, you know, what nuclear weapons provide. Do you think that the Russians would have done what they did in terms of invasion, occupation, and annexation of parts of Ukraine and continuing destabilization of Ukraine if Ukraine had a few nuclear weapons at its disposal? The answer from those Ukrainian politicians is, excuse the aphorism, hell no. But the concern with those systems was because the Russian Federation went such to a bad patch in terms of its own military, in terms of its infrastructure, etc., there were very real fears about the stability and solidity of their command and control systems. And there was actually a lot sort of below the radar of assistance given by the United States and some of the other Western powers in making sure that those systems were watertight and locked down. Now, you get to the case of China. You assume that there's a certain level of technological capacity, innovation, and command and control, well, lots of command and control in the case of China. You then look at India. You then look at Pakistan, and nobody is meaning to be pejorative, but you are asking the smaller countries with less stable political systems, more fractious political systems, the extent to which those systems are locked down and stable is a case of ongoing concern. There's no two ways about it. And then, you know, you put half a dozen of these in the hands of Kim Jong-un, and God knows.
I think we've got 2 questions left. We've got one over here and yourself there.
Oh, yeah. First of all, thank you for a great talk. Second of all, there's been a lot of focus today on statehood and rogue states and established states, and you just mentioned as well, you know, command and control. But there's been also a discourse over the last, you know, decades about non-state actors and the proliferation of intrastate and non-state conflict. And if you go by the mad allegory that you mentioned earlier, you know, Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, so Iraq might see, at least some years ago, that it would make sense to also acquire nuclear weapons and so on and so forth, but then you have a whole region destabilized by non-state actors. Is there any kind of discourse that crosses over from the non-state actor into nuclear proliferation on how to solve that dilemma?
The discourse that exists is one of containment and control. So if you're thinking, containment control of the technology and of the fissile materials. So the discourse is, how do we make sure that the only people who have this stuff are people who should have this stuff? Then you get into a conversation, well, what would happen if a Daesh ISIS had this capacity? What would happen if, you know, rogue terrorist group, take your pick, developed a dirty bomb that could be, metaphorically dropped off a large building in a built-up area? And then you bleed over into whole conversations about crime and control and security, etc., which is a very different kind of conversation. So I suppose my long-winded answer to the question is there are 2 conversations. One at this macro level, as you say, in terms of the interstate dynamics and strategies, and then a subsidiary conversation about the non-state actors, the terrorist groups. But again, you're talking about something quite different, because you're not talking about, you know, the 1.2 megaton dropping and exploding in air over a population center. You're talking about a very rudimentary, dirty kind of bomb, you know, let off in a public space in an area, and the damage that could cause, not just the physical damage, but the psychological damage of knowing that they had nuclear weapons. But they're two sort of parallel conversations with a certain level of intersection, but they're certainly not an integrated view, no.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm just wondering if you feel the European Union has had any role in either kind of preventing the development of more widespread nuclear capacity, and also, you know, given the fact that, well, now one of its member states has nuclear weapons, and if you feel that the exit of that other member state could have any role in future developments.
I think that's a really, really good question. I mean, one of the things you have to bear in mind with respect to the European Union is it is very much committed to the NPT regime. And you may have noticed that it was the European Union that was in the chair for the negotiations that led to the agreement with Iran. First Lady Ashton and then Federica Mogherini. And it was their teams, as part of the P3+3 or P5+1, however you want to describe it, of negotiating teams that negotiated successfully with Iran. With Donald Trump's determination to abrogate or at least to question the legitimacy of Iran's position in that agreement, you've seen very forceful statements from Federica Mogherini saying, no, this is an international agreement, we stand with the agreement, and regardless of what Trump will do unilaterally, we will stand in force and sustain this agreement. So on that sense, the European Union is foursquare behind this international regime. Going forward, though, you raise a really interesting point. I mean, not so much that the UK is out and only France is left, but remember that for 22 of the soon-to-be 27 member states, NATO is their core defensive guarantee. NATO is predicated on a first-strike nuclear capacity. because of the conventional weapons asymmetry between the NATO member states and the Russian Federation. So they presume their strategy based on nuclear first strike. We also have statements, not from the current president, but from previous French presidents, who said, if the European Union were to get its act together on security and defense, if we had a really integrated security and defense within the European Union and a mutual security guarantee, that is, say, a common defense, France would be only too delighted to put its nuclear capacity at the disposal of this integrated United States of Europe. Now that raises interesting conversations. Because again, for 22 of the 27, that's simply logical, normal, and moving on from where we are. For a country like this, it would be hugely controversial, and I can't imagine an Irish government subscribing to it. So there are certainly issues there in terms of where the European Union stands. And one final point, which is just an interesting wrinkle and brings in some global politics, one of the things the European Union always insists on in any of its free trade agreements with other countries is it insists on a human rights clause, and it insists on a clause on nuclear non-proliferation and weapons of mass destruction. And one of the things that has thwarted an EU-India free trade agreement is the European Union's insistence on a nuclear non-proliferation clause in their trade agreement, and the Indians' absolute and forthright determination to not accept any such clause. Because from an Indian perspective, that is simply good old-fashioned imperialism once more, and they're not having any of it, particularly in respect of their sensitivities on the NPT regime to start with. So there are some fascinating things going forward in terms of nuclear policy on the part of the European Union.
Amazing and brilliant.
Gosh, thank you very much.
I wasn't expecting that to talk. I think looking to 2018, I think arming yourself.
Arming yourself?
Bad use of the word.
Everybody should have a nuclear weapon for Christmas.
Everyone should have a nuclear weapon for Christmas. But also educating yourself and becoming activists just as a person or as part of a group is really important. We are delighted to have you guys here for the night course. The very last one is Pete Lunn, looking at economic collapse and potential perfect storm of all the speakers joining together and fighting it out to the death. That'll be on the 10th, and everyone's welcome. Many thanks again to Pete Tonner. Thank you very much, guys.
Cheers.